Hello guys, and welcome to my history of ESO video. So this is going to be a cool little video that goes over the first iteration of the game for about the first year. So we're going to be looking at patch 1.0 up until patch 2.0. So just up until patch 2.0. We're not going to look after 2.0 since otherwise it's going to be way too long of an episode. So this is a really cool video, guys. I really hope you enjoy it. We've got lots of retro ESO footage on here from the early days. We even have footage here, as you can see, of me playing a bash build. This was when the game first came out during batch 1.0. So let's jump into the video, guys. We're going to see how PvP has changed over the years, and yeah, we're going to look at some footage and we're going to see it firsthand as well as talk about it. So let's jump right into it, guys. Alright guys, and I just want to say that I am playing on the PCNA server, and I always have, so the video is going to be done from the perspective of a PCNA player. So let's begin. Patch 1.0, April 1st, 2014, ESO launches. And it all begins. ESO all begins. And this was a cool patch for PvP for a couple reasons. Number one, nobody knew what the heck they were doing at this time. The only people who had any idea what they were doing were beta players, and everybody else was just completely lost. So you can say pretty safely that 99% of Cyrodiil had no clue what to do. I mean, they didn't even know how to CC break at this time. It was absolutely insane to understand how to PvP just a little bit during this time gave you such an edge over other players. So there you have it. Something that was going on during this patch is Magicka DKs were super OP. Now there's a couple reasons for that. Magicka DK just kind of had the best kit from the get-go for PvP in this game. Looking at Battle Roar returning resources was a huge deal. And the meta during this time, if anybody kind of knew what was going on, they knew that there was a lot of different things that you could do, a lot of different things that were borderline broken, but the best thing to do during this phase was an alt-gen build. As you can see here, on my Templar, you can see me rocking the alt-gen build here. So much ultimate coming out. So the reason that an alt build was considered the best spec for this era of the game was simply because you generated alt pretty much off everything. Critical hits generated you ultimate, just landing attacks generated you ultimate, healing yourself generated you ultimate. You generated ultimate from everything, and it was a lot. As you could see there, we got off 3 clouding swarms on top of those guys before leaving the fight, and the alt gen is just absolutely insane. So anyone who understood that early on knew how to take advantage of other people in PvP and really wreck them. It was simply just go for the alt-gen builds all around. Doesn't really matter what class you were on, but the big ones during this time were Magicka DK and then of course Magicka Sorcerer, who could both get their ultimate costs down using a bug with Vampirism to like 4 ultimate to use their ultimate. 4 ultimate. I mean, they literally had to land 1 attack and they have another ult up. Absolutely insane during this era, guys. Alright guys, so fast forward to May 23rd, 2014, patch 1.1 drops. We get to have cool things like death recap, battle leveling is introduced to the game, and it is buffed to make the lower level players not absolute crap against a high level player. The NPCs in Cyrodiil got rebalanced to Vet 5 to make them a little bit weaker. A lot of noobs were just getting wiped, like 20-30 man Zergs would just wipe to a resource when the game first came out. So these were all kind of changes that needed to be done. When it came to class balance during this era, we saw a lot of the classes just get touched up to work properly. Not necessarily many balance or any balance changes kind of made during this time, more like just making sure the abilities are firing off properly. There were various fixes to make quality of life in Cyrodiil better, such as dead people not being able to pull you out of stealth anymore. Absolutely hilarious. We also saw a hybrid meta, I guess you could call it, during this time. Now, as you can see here, I'm playing what is quite clearly a Magicka Templar, but if you look at my stat distribution, it's very hybrid-esque. for the time. We had pretty similar size pools between our max magicka and max stamina. Now, the reason that the hybrid build was the meta of the time was due to the fact that we had soft caps in the game. And the way that soft caps works is if you got your stats past a certain point, you would now only get 50% of the return past that point. So for example, if you had 30k stamina and you tried to get to 35k stamina, you would need to invest at least around 40k stamina worth in order to get that value. Now, that being said, at this time, stamina was max valued at around 2,400, so everybody's stats were quite a bit lower, and it wasn't until much later in the game that we got that 10 times change to stats where everybody went from 3k to 30k, etc. And of course, during this period of time, we had the major metas kind of begin to emerge for early on PvP. We had the Negate Sorc and the Magicka DK, as I mentioned earlier, that had kind of come into fruition during the very first patch. And then this patch, we started to see a lot more Magplar as well as Sap Tank Nightblades. We saw more and more Sap Tank Nightblade as time went on, as it was just such a good build for the PvP during this time due to the alt gen that you could get on it. So when May 31st comes around, we see alt gen nerfed from 3 to 1 on crits, so this is a huge change that really puts the first big stick in Dragon Knight for the most part, but just the alt gen builds in general and how they were overperforming at the beginning of the game. So this is the first kind of nerf that we see there. We also see DK take a few minor nerfs to standard and their volatile armor. On June 8th, we see Bolt Escape nerfed to cost 50% more if you cast it twice in a row, and so on. So before this, Bolt Escape was pretty much unchecked, and Sorcs were just able to escape/spam Bolt indefinitely, as long as they had enough regen to keep it going. So this was a really welcome change to see Sorc kind of nerfed to the point where it can't just easily run away from anything in the game, and this made Sorc no longer the fastest class in PvP. I think it actually still was the fastest, but not by the massive margin that it was before. Alright, so June 23rd comes and we see patch 1.2. This is the beginning of the infamous lighting patch, 1.2 to 1.3, also known as Rip Your Frame Rate, PvP crowd is gone. There was a huge issue with lighting in PvP when these two patches, 1.3 and 1.2, came out that resulted in the game being just pretty much unplayable if people were spamming certain abilities, and it just led to PvP being absolute crap during this time. We also saw more fixes for general play for everybody. DK gets their Lash Heal buffed. Igneous heals. Igneous gives you the healing bonus now. Nightblade's Cloak finally gets some more fixes from aggro and breaking. Nightblade Cloak was so terrible during the beginning of the game. Everything broke it. Sorc gets Dark Deal. Dark Deal is now movement based as well, so you can move it while you cast it. So early Dark Deal Sorc iterations coming in. Pets can now stealth and don't pull you out of stealth anymore when they're aggressive and you're not. Overload is now a thing. Overload light attacks get added during this patch. Templar gets a buff to blinding flashes, one of the most OP Templar abilities that they had access to, which just pretty much made everyone around you miss all their attacks. Very, very strong. Snipe gets changed to a 2-second cast time, so Snipe no longer takes forever like it used to. Stamina builds still had a place, but mag builds were dominating during this time. Stamina builds were kind of just getting invented / figured out. As you can see here, as we're working up the patches, I end up transitioning more and more into stamina-based builds, and this was just during the era where stamina builds were getting figured out by the devs and the players as well, trying to figure out how to get them to work in the environment competitively with Magicka builds. And on a little fun fact, we did see One Hand and Shield have the requirement of wielding a shield now, so no more one-handed warriors. And then the passives, of course, for Nord, Khajiit, Orc, and Wood Elf were adjusted, which was really sweet. We saw some PvP hints come on our death recaps for when we die, like Watch Your Step as well. And of course, Mist is no longer interruptible. Very strange, hey? Very strange. During this era, there was also a bug with Fighters Guild abilities that allowed them to quite easily one-shot vampires, so poor vampires during this time kind of get screwed over a little bit. And like I said with the stamina divide, we saw medium armor get some cost reduction changes as well, so medium armor slowly moving into a place of viability during this patch. On June 30th, we saw shards get fixed. Yay, vampires! No more silver shards wrecking you from stealth, but that was not the real fix. It still happened. In July 6th, we see a second iteration for the fix before it starts working. On the 30th, we also had a grand healing and regeneration FPS fix, so this was part of the lighting patch issues that we were having during this time. On the 21st, there was a speed hack with Clouding Swarm that was fixed, revolving Clouding Swarm and Night's Silence. Caltrops also received a performance fix similar to the issues we were having during the lighting patch as well. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, feel free to hit that like and subscribe button at any point during this video. If we can get 100 likes within the first week, I will release the second video as soon as possible. I'll start working on it right away, and if we can get the 100 likes, I will put it out before I leave for my Christmas holidays. So there you have it, guys. Also, big shout out to that last little fight there. That was a 1v6 without a heal. That was pretty significant for the time. I think that was the biggest 1vx fight I ever got on this build prior to getting Rally as the heal. But anyway, guys, August 4th hits. We are now during patch 1.3. Chillrend is coming in. Wabbajack is out. Dyes are added to the game. Weapon swap, is finally adjusted to be faster and smoother, so animation canceling begins to become a bigger part of the game after this patch, in my opinion. The Wep swap was a huge change for animation canceling. During this time, people were also trading a lot. They were trading Emperorship, and what that is kind of they just get someone to the highest rank on the leaderboard, they'd crown them, and then what they would do is that player would leave the campaign and allow the next person in place to get crowned afterwards once the keeps were taken back. So Emp trading was a thing. They added different kinds of blocks, such as minimum AP values in order to become Emperor to prevent this from happening, but for the most part, it just went on completely unchecked. Weapon abilities were now allowed to proc enchants, kind of a big deal. Siege weapons now degraded. The big deal about that was that people would commonly just put 20 oils on the ground outside a keep, and that would give you 20 out of 20 siege for that keep, and no, oils are not going to take that wall down. So it was pretty much just a troll to prevent a team or faction from putting siege up around a certain keep. DKs saw a fix to their Magma Armor, reducing the damage it deals by 10 times. Let's just think about that. It was dealing 10 times too much damage, so each tick before was dealing the full damage. Absolutely insane. So that got fixed there. Templar's Sun Shield no longer stops your Magicka recovery, but on top of it, shields during this patch could no longer stack together. There was an issue with Sun Shield stacking on top of other shields, which allowed it to deal more damage than intended, so that was removed as well. Blinding Light will lock players who block off balance, so Blinding Flash is here, yet again gets another really good buff to counter the really heavy block meta that we kind of had at this time, Sword and Board being by far the most prevalent weapon set as well. It was also during this patch that we saw heavy attacks begin to restore resources, with Restoration Staff, of course, restoring more than the other weapons on hit. We saw an Undeath nerf from Vampire, so Vampirism took a bit of a nerf here, which was fine. Vampirism, of course, overperforming like crazy during the earlier patches of this game. And there were a few more little bug fixes, such as Meteor no longer desyncing your health bar, amongst other skills that could desync your health bar at the time. And then finally, my personal favorite patch note from patch 1.3, as a Nord, your 6% damage reduction will now actually reduce the damage you take instead of increasing it. That's right, for the longest time I played a Nord and just took 6% more damage. Come on. Anyway, glad that gets fixed. August 12th, we see the insane ultimate damage bug getting fixed. We see some memory leaks getting fixed on August 13th, fixing kind of the frame rate issues that we were having in Cyrodiil. And of course, on August 25th, we see a fix to buff stacking, allowing you to stack insane amounts of weapon and spell damage that you shouldn't have been able to stack before. Okay guys, so now we're coming into patch 1.4, and we see a lot of just little fixes to Cyrodiil, etc. Heavy attacks are now restoring more resources. Medium armor gets another buff to cost reduction. Restoration Staff now restores more magicka on heavy attack and does not deal 10% extra damage, so Restoration Staff sees itself disappear as the #1 DPS staff. So during this patch, we saw a lot of buffs to weapon ability damage in general. Nirnhoned was also added to the game during this patch. We saw a lot of weapon swap fixes, little bits of fixes like stuck in combat, etc., but these would continue to plague the game for a while to come. DK saw a Ember Heal nerf. Scales no longer charged you magicka and stamina per item or projectile that you reflected, so this was essentially a great buff to DK Wings, which was kind of underperforming before this. Nightblade had massive cloak dot fixes, so Nightblade could now effectively counter dots with its cloak. Sork's volatile damage was fixed. Its volatile familiar was doing twice as much damage as it was supposed to. Streak was nerfed yet again. Alt Gen was nerfed as well. We had light armor penetration get nerfed during this time. Light armor getting pushed over a little bit, but still being the best armor choice / weight for this patch. Medium armor finally gets the weapon damage buff that it has now, but it's still not really enough to make stam builds stand out during this patch. We saw some vampire fixes to movement speed stacking. This was a hilarious glitch that you could also recreate using DK Talons at the time, so we saw some crazy movement speed glitches get fixed out of the game as well. Silver Bolts was now transformed into a stamina-based skill, so it's no longer magicka-based. And then on September 29th, we have a fix come in that prevents vet rank players from logging back into the non-veteran campaigns. Kind of a big deal, I think. Templar gets a B shield nerf yet again. It's still overperforming and doing more damage than it should. The restoration staff fix that I mentioned earlier actually gets implemented into the game during this time after not being successfully patched earlier. Crit Rush gets a fix as well, and we see annulment only absorb spell projectiles. So these are kind of the last changes coming into 1.5, which is widely regarded as the most glorious patch of this game. So in patch 1.5, we saw forward camps go away, stealth damage was reduced, projectiles were fixed to no longer stun you before they hit you, CCing an opponent now generated more ultimate. 1.5 was interestingly the last patch of dynamic ultimate generation as well. We see a few fixes again to the different classes, but no huge changes to the classes. We see two-handed weapons getting some huge buffs here. Heavy weapons being introduced to two-handed. They get the heal-off momentum now. One-hand and shield gets a lot of buffs as well. Great utility changes, as well as increase in their decrease in their cost and increase in their ability damage. Dual wield gets a similar treatment, increase in damage, decrease in cost. We see off balance added to flurry, as well as extra bleeds. The bow gets buffed as well. Poison injection is introduced to the game as a viable bow execute, and damage buff to snipe was also implemented as well. Snipe also had its minimum range removed during this patch as well, and we saw a huge buff to volley too. We also see Harness Magicka restoring Magicka this patch as well, so we see that slow kind of change in ESO towards you having a lot of different viable options of things that you can do in combat to up your resource return, and we just see kind of general sustain and damage buffs along all weapons for this patch, including the Destruction Staff. We saw a few as well. So there you have it, and then finally the Vampire Healing Ultimate gets nerfed a little bit this patch also. And then on November 9th, we get a fix where you no longer block / dodge your own two-handed heals, so that's pretty sweet. And then finally, guys, we transition into patch 1.6. So some big things came with patch 1.6, guys. The first big thing that comes in is the champion system. We are now introduced to the champion system. We have access to it, and it pretty much just makes everybody more powerful. Everyone's stats is times by 10 in 1.6 as well. It's not exactly 10. It's a little bit more than that, I believe, but it's around 10 times more stats for everyone. So everybody's stats look bigger, but essentially the game statistically hasn't changed other than everything's been multiplied by 10. And finally, we see soft caps removed from stats altogether as well. Something that we also see is the justice system getting put into the game. We see alt scaling added to the game, where the alt that you use is dependent upon your highest offensive stats, as opposed to whether it's a magicka or stamina-based alt. We also see V14 gear introduced into the game as well. And then finally, during this era, there was no cap on the amount of champion points that you could have. So just to put that in perspective, when I was playing during this time, I fought a player with 1,600 champion points. It is 3 years since the time that ESO has come out at least, and I still don't have 1,000 champion points. But you can imagine just how strong someone with 1,600 champion points would be compared to someone with 300. Just infinitely more powerful. So there you have it. CP grinding became a thing. Grinding CP made you very, very strong during this patch. Medium armor had some big armor buffs. Medium armor was now worth 75% that of heavy armor, so you had a lot more armor value on your medium armor. Crit resistance was changed now to reduce the bonus damage that it deals like it does today, as opposed to reducing your opponent's chance to crit. Synergies were now scaling off your highest stats. We removed AoE hard caps from the game. Now, there were still some hard caps. You deal less damage as you hit more targets, but this was the first time we saw hard cap removal kind of come into the game. Standardized buffs were added to the game to prevent you from buff stacking like we had talked about in the past. And finally, dynamic alt was now dead, and the alt generation system that we have today was put into place, where your alt is based off of a certain trickle over time, and you can use different abilities to increase that trickle. And then finally, the big change that I noticed coming into patch 1.6, and you can probably notice from watching the footage of this ghost here as we're just watching it versus the 1.5 we were playing Darklight in the clip before. Look how much smoother and how much faster the cancels are in 1.6. Huge changes were made to the game to make animation canceling a big part of the game. So this was kind of when ZeniMax really embraced canceling, not only embracing it, but polishing up the system so it's even fun to play and even smoother to use than before. So a big thing that happened during this patch, especially with the introduction of the champion system, is we really saw the divide between Magicka and stamina builds. Up until patch 1.5, most builds were still fairly hybrid-esque, but we had seen a lot of people peel towards Magicka more than anything else, and as you could see, I was running a stam build for the last few iterations of the early patches there too. But we saw a lot of people transition into full-on Magicka, full-on stamina builds during this time. Stamina builds came into a lot of power, with Stamina Nightblade taking king as the strongest stamina class in the game from 1.6 pretty much onward until Warden was released. So absolutely incredible patch for stam builds. I don't know what to say. We also saw Emp get buffed a little bit, so Emp was a little bit stronger. Battle Spirit now reduces your healing damage and shields, not by a huge amount. We see that big reduction come in later on in the game during the Imperial City patch. The bleeds now ignore all armor. There are no interrupts on melee channels, so no more interrupting a Wrecking Blow. So this is kind of the birth of the Wrecking Blow spam builds, because now it's possible to do it and not just get bashed and wrecked. You cannot block while feared anymore, so this made Stamina Nightblade even more powerful against what was a fairly heavy block meta prior to 1.6, and a lot of people tried to stick to it and ended up getting wrecked pretty hard by Stam Blades using Fierce intelligibly against them. We also saw swap while dodge rolling added to the game, and we saw a fix to a massive 1.6 beta bug. Sorry, not a beta, a public test server bug. And this public test server bug was one of the craziest bugs I ever saw. I mean, it's straight up, your damage just started scaling higher and higher, and within about 15 minutes of playing, you were hitting like 10 times harder than you should. So it was good to see that get fixed before this patch went live. The DK standard got nerfed to cost 250 alt as opposed to 200 from before. We also saw DK's Fiery Grip Gap Closer get introduced to the game. Inferno was removed, so blinds in general were removed from the game this patch. So the DK blind that they had access to was replaced with the Inferno toggle, which now has that projectile that swims around you. And Scales was changed to reflect only 4 projectiles. Molten Weapons was given to DK, allowing DK to open up the heavy attack build for 40% heavy attack buffs, and DK was given minor brutality to its class kit as well. Nightblade was given Major Defile to Deathstroke, the best alt in the game now. Major Defile, 20% increased damage. This is what Deathstroke looks like today. It was patch 1.6 when Nightblade finally got it, and it changed Stamblade and Nightblade in general just huge forever. They were given 3 different stamina abilities as Nightblades. They were given Surprise Attack, Killer's Blade, and Teleport Strike. So 1.6 was also the introduction of stamina morphs. Prior to this, all abilities had only Magicka morphs, and the only way to get stamina skills was to run weapon skills. We also saw Grim Focus get added to Stamina Nightblade, giving them access to not Minor Berserk at the time, but a very similar buff that would turn into Minor Berserk. We had some cloak fixes come in. Minor Maim was added to Fear. Pots now grant Ultimate, as opposed to granting more resources for a Nightblade. So rip the old school Nightblade pot build. This was a very old sap tank variation that no longer was viable thanks to this change. And there you have it. Sork was given more pet fixes. Curse was buffed by quite a bit. Dark Deal was now given a Stam morph as well, and Overload got a huge 50% damage buff on light attacks, so a huge buff to Overload. Surge and Major Brutality were also added to Sork, giving Sork access to the Major Brutality as well. And then Templar gets Stam Jabs, Stam Javelin, and Power of the Light. And Templar also, unfortunately, gets Radiant Destruction this patch. I think Templar underwent the most changes during 1.6, but as you can see, it was a very heavy balance change patch for this game. A lot of changes were made, and it had a pretty big impact on class balance after this time. Templar also got 6% weapon damage instead of 3% now. They were given Major Resolve and Ward added to the Protection rune, which was huge, giving Templar that armor buff. So there you have it, and the blinds were finally gone. Major Defile was added to Dark Flare, and Major Spell Crit added to Sunfire as well. Nova dropped to 250 Ultimate. So we saw a lot of great changes to Templar, kind of increasing our viability in combat, as well as giving us access to different kinds of kits, but removing Blinding Flashes, arguably the most OP defensive ability that we have access to, or had access to at the time. We saw Empower added to Wrecking Blow, which eventually gets removed later on in the game. Major Brutality was added to Momentum. Now, Momentum before this didn't actually give you Major Brutality, it just gave you a heal. So now Major Brutality was added to Greatsword as well. One Hand and Shield was given Major Fracture and Puncture. And Dual Wield gets Blade Cloak for the movement speed bonus and loses its AoE Dagger Toss. And Bow gets Major Defile on Snipe. Light Armor finally gets some flat spell penetration, not based off how many pieces of armor you're wearing. Shuffle gets Major Evasion added to it, so this is the beginning of the Shuffle meta, and we'll slowly see how that turns out next episode, of course. Heavy Armor becomes HP oriented. Heavy Armor also gets quite a few buffs to sustain as well this patch. Vampirism takes 40% less damage, more damage from fire, and Werewolf takes 40% more damage from poison, as opposed to 50% from before. Elusive Mist is now a morph option for Vampire, adding this speed option. Now, fun fact, as you can see in early Ghost iterations, this Elusive Mist buff gives you Major Expedition, but the roll dodge buff at this time that Bow had was not Major Expedition, it was a separate buff, so you could stack both of them together, giving you really fast mist at the time. And then finally, Fighters Guild, Dawnbreaker was fixed to have no cast time anymore. It used to have a 1-second cast time, and Mage Light finally gives you access to Spell Critical. So all in all, coming into patch 1.6, this was the final kind of big patch and big changes that happened prior to 2.0 hitting, and we saw the game transition into a game that gave you viable options for both stamina and magicka builds. Unfortunately, hybrid during patch 1.6 really wasn't an option. A few people, I think, had tried to go for it, but we never really saw any really successful hybrid builds for this time, and we wouldn't see them until a little bit later in the game. That being said, though, stamina builds finally taking their seat as one of the strongest specs in the game. Up until patch 1.6, stamina builds were so underwhelming, so this was really the patch for stam builds. And one of my personal favorite patches to play through. As you can see here, this was the first patch that I actually came up with and started playing Ghost, my favorite Templar build that I still play today. Absolutely love this build. So there you have it, guys. I really hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I thought it would be really cool to do something like this for you guys and watch a little bit of a PvP commentary / history of ESO. So if you guys enjoyed this video, as always, feel free to hit that like and subscribe button. I just want to give a quick shout out to Moxie, a YouTuber who doesn't actually make regular ESO content, but I had used a little bit of his DK footage there because I wanted a little bit of an example of how OP DK was early on in the game, and I actually didn't play one early in the game, so I didn't have my own footage to go with. But that was the most ridiculous Dragon Knight clip that I could find. So I hope you guys like that. Go ahead and check his channel out. Link in the description if you guys want to see the original clip. It's about 20 minutes long. And then I guess to end it up today, guys, I'm just going to say thank you for watching. This is my first try at a video like this. It took a really long time to make, and I had mentioned it earlier in the video that if we can get 100 likes in the first week, I will make the second video, the patch 2.0 and on for you guys as soon as I can, and I'll do it before I leave for the Christmas holidays. So please hit that like button if you guys enjoyed this kind of video. And as always, if you have any comments for me, feel free to leave them in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Have a fantastic night, and I'll see you next time.